we do have a distinctive history in this country of opening our doors to people from other countries. We believe it's possible to assimilate new arrivals to Americanism, to what it means to be an American. But if you take that out of context and you just make it into this a caricature of itself, then you end up in this position where anybody who comes here can believe and say and do anything that he wants. And actually, that's better than the constitutional ordered liberty that our ancestors sort of established in this country. The idea used to be you come here and then you become an American. Now, of course, the inverse of that is true. It's people from, foreign lands, people with alternative religions, people with any manner of extravagant idea besides Americanism are the ones that we are supposed to effectively capitulate to. And this strikes me as just a recipe. It is effectively a suicide pact.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. As Harry Truman observed, there's nothing new in the world, only the history you don't know. It certainly seems many of us are still chained up in Plato's cave, confined to our perceptions of distortions of reality, enslaved by our senses, incapable of reason. This was poignantly driven home by the criminal conviction of President Trump in Manhattan recently. We learned nearly half, or maybe more than half, I think it's too close to call, of America believes the ends justify the means when it comes to destroying Trump and their political opponents generally. They have little understanding of or interest in dangerous precedents, perhaps in part because they don't fear conservatives, and perhaps in part because they don't care to look beyond the tips of their noses. They are insulated by money and the mediating civic and cultural institutions they dominate. Assuming the good sense and common decency of the silent majority will carry the day is waiting for Godot. So if a revolt against this Jacobin ruling class is something of interest to us, we might want to get to it in earnest. But what would a real moral and intellectual revolt even look like? What would it entail? That's where our guest today, Spencer Klaven, comes in to provide some historical precedent from which we might learn if indeed now is the time to act with alacrity. Claven is a classicist with a PhD from Oxford. He's like a younger Victor Davis Hanson. His book, How to Save the West, is must reading on the topic. Claven is also the editor-at-large for The American Mind. He's the host of the Young Heretics podcast and the author of the substack Rejoice Evermore. His new book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God, comes out in August. We'll look forward to that. Spencer Klaven, welcome to Counterculture. Thanks so much.
It's a delight to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
So I want to start with this piece that you wrote recently at your Substack about Churchill's whiskey, basically, and the parallel you made to sort of where Britain was under Churchill, and where America is at present against the backdrop of the story that will dominate the rest of the presidential election, of course, which is Trump's criminal conviction. So yeah, the parallel.
Yeah, so this is during World War II when supplies and resources were tight. The British government had to tighten down on barley supplies because you need to feed your soldiers, you need to use what resources you have for the war effort. And not everybody knows this, but Scotch whiskey, for which Scotland, of course, is famous, and lots of us in the States love to drink it, Scotch requires barley. You can only make it with barley. And so during this time, one of the sad necessities of the war is that many of the distilleries, in fact, all of the legal distilleries, basically had to shut down production. And famously, as the war was nearing its end, Churchill issued this directive to make absolutely sure that after the war, they weren't going to keep the barley shut down. They were going to make sure there was some set aside for Scotland. And this seems like a small thing, but what's so striking to me about it is the way that Churchill presents this instruction. He says this is a distinctive part of our national history and character. It's not just we need to start making more widgets so that we can build our economy back up again. It's that Scotch whiskey is Scottish, and it's an emblem of Scottishness. It comes with this hundreds of years of history. It's part of who we are, and it's part of what makes us distinctive. This is a country unlike any other, and Britain more generally needs to preserve its national character. And if you think about this and you just imagine like Joe Biden issuing a trade directive that we were absolutely going to have to protect, say, Ford cars. I mean, maybe you can picture him doing this, but the degree of pride in who we are, in certain things, just because they're ours and they're good, is something I think long before we had this disgraceful guilty verdict in the Trump case, long before we reached the really, I think, dire situation that we're now in. We've spent decades just letting go of these little cultural things, which, you know, each one of them might be small. You might say, well, it's okay if we don't allow the display of the Ten Commandments because, you know, we've got religion in churches. You might, you know, allow each one thing to go, but sooner or later you turn around and you realize that the entire country is transformed. And I think it's something we can kind of miss when we're in these periods of real catastrophe. We think we've got to immediately, you know, reestablish every possible major legal thing we don't have control over. But actually, these smaller things, these cultural matters, might be the first step on the way to building things back.
Yeah, it seems to me like, right, so national character has become a dirty phrase. That's supposed
Right.
to indicate some sort of supremacy, you know, particularly Western supremacy, white supremacy. It's supposed to be a vestige of the colonialism and so forth. And it's seen as being disrespectful to other cultures. And so it's been really interesting how the left has been able to manipulate us out of this respect for a national identity, particularly in a melting pot like America. And I think we've seen this over the last several years. I mean, you're right. It's little things. It's school nicknames and things like that. But then now we've seen it really accelerate with the defacing of statues and the renaming of colleges on campuses and things like this. And that's all part of it too. It seems to me that they've convinced people that what America was, sort of the same thing that's happened in Western Europe over the last 30 years with their multiculturalism. What these countries were, it not only wasn't good enough, but it was an affront to other people that were not indigenous or immigrant communities or, you know, other communities that became to be identified as marginalized. And so everything about what was has to be eradicated in order to usher in what is now.
Yeah, Americans and Europeans are the only people who aren't allowed to celebrate their distinctive heritage and culture. You notice multiculturalism never really means my ancestors came from the Germanic tribes that settled England. That's not
Right.
that's not part of the grand parade of civilizations. And Roger Scruton, the great conservative philosopher, had a really good word for this. He called it oikophobia, which is the fear or the hatred of things that come from your own soil and your own land. And I think this is a way in which Americans' ideology has really been twisted and perverted against them because, as I think you just indicated, we do have a distinctive history in this country of opening our doors to people from other countries. We believe it's possible to assimilate new arrivals to Americanism, to what it means to be an American. But if you take that out of context and you just make it into this a caricature of itself, then you end up in this position where anybody who comes here can believe and say and do anything that he wants. And actually, that's better than the constitutional ordered liberty that our ancestors sort of established in this country. The idea used to be you come here and then you become an American. Now, of course, the inverse of that is true. It's people from, you know, foreign lands, people with alternative religions, people with any manner of extravagant idea besides Americanism are the ones that we are supposed to effectively capitulate to. And this strikes me as just a recipe. It is effectively a suicide pact, and no understanding of the American experiment can possibly amount to we just need to roll over and die. And so I do think that we've got to get over our horror at the idea of simply saying these traditions, this constitution, this way of life is ours, and it's actually good and beautiful and has done many excellent things. And so it's not that we are hateful for wanting to limit the flow of immigration, for wanting to assimilate people to the American way of life, but simply actually that we're filled with love for what this country is, or at least what it used to be.
I mean, if you were advising, say, President Trump, in terms of that Churchill Scotch whiskey moment, I mean, part of it now is you're trying to think of what is sort of uniquely American in the way that maybe once upon a time General Motors was, or I guess, apple pie, maybe that still is. I mean, is it,
Right.
you almost sort of search for what would be something that would be unifying in that way, that's part of a national identity that would be celebrated regardless of your ethnic heritage and all the other identitarian categories.
Well, I think back to near the last moments of Trump's first term, I hope the first of second of two, when he issued that directive for a national sculpture garden. I don't know if you remember this, but it was part of
Oh
2020
yeah,
when
yeah, yeah,
everybody was
yeah.
tearing those statues down. And I think that was one of the best moments of his presidency. It came too late, and he had at that point already really been wrong-footed by the sort of COVID bureaucracy and, of course, by the riots of 2020. But when he did that, I thought that's the right note, right? This sense that there is a long and continuous tradition of American heroes, and not just that it's wrong to tear down their statues, but that we're actually going to be building statues to them. And we're going to be taking an active role. The government even is going to be taking an active role in celebrating our heritage. I think that's a perfect example of the kind of thing he should do if, God willing, he gets in this next election. And I recall, as I'm thinking about this, as I'm thinking about the challenge which will immediately come, which is that this is racist and evil and hateful and somehow backwards to want to do this. There was this famous literary figure whose name I'm forgetting, unfortunately, but he was from, I think, South America, and somebody said, where is or he was from Africa, and somebody said, where is the African War and Peace? As this kind of actually racist challenge, that the African people have never produced anything great. And this guy said, war and peace is our war and peace. In other words,
Yes.
this American heritage belongs to people of every race. That's always been part of the plan. There's nothing racist in endorsing it. But in order to believe that, you have to require that people claim this Americanism as their birthright, as their heritage. I think we should be raising statues to our heroes throughout our history, but I also think we should be doing things like offering prizes for great works of patriotic literature. Why is it that all of the literary prizes are run by commies and leftists? That there's no reason why that should be the case. Government prizes for the arts, government endowments for the arts are very much part of our tradition. Conservatives tend to be antsy and kind of scared about them because they seem to represent government intervention or propaganda or whatever. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with the government endorsing and rewarding patriotic art, and I think we ought to. I think it's a kind of essential part of what we are going to need to reclaim our way of life.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, and maybe it's not stressed enough. But the flip side of that, what you were talking about, is that war and peace is our war and peace. So Frederick Douglass is a part of the American story. I get to access Frederick Douglass just as a Black American does, because I respect his scholarship and the example he led, and Harriet Tubman. And and all of the heroes across all of the racial and identitarian intersections for this country's history. They're part of what made America the greatest country the world has ever seen. And so that's the whole point. I mean, I guess, maybe, you're right about that, statue, that garden of statues, to our heroes. It would have been great if he had sort of, rolled out that working list too, to show the broad
Right.
cross section, time, and all these categories, and say, understand what we're doing. That really would be sort of interesting to do. And then there's always going to be people left out. But now the flip side of what these neo-Marxists have done was exemplified a few years ago when the African American History Museum opened up in DC, and they leave Clarence Thomas out of it.
Of course. Of course. Well, this is why Joe Biden said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Because the catch, the secret punchline to all of this identitarian rhetoric about belonging and inclusion and uplifting marginalized voices and whatever other jargon you want to throw out there, the secret is that these identity categories aren't actually about what they claim to be about. It's not really about black people. It's not really about gay people. It's not really about women. It's all about power and politics. And this is a classic Marxist technique to subordinate every form of identity to your political allegiance and to the party. Biden or whoever was whispering in his ear in that moment, really meant that. That really is an actual point of faith and belief on the intersectional left, is that your acceptance into these favored categories, your real bona fides or authenticity as a black person, as a woman, as a gay person, whatever, is dependent upon your voting for them, upon your giving over your power to people that want to repossess your country and sell it for scrap. And when they talk about how they stand for black people, how they stand for gay people or whatever, you just always have to remember that African American Museum or Joe Biden saying, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. These offerings, these sort of the bait they hold out of belonging is always contingent upon your submitting to whatever new political demand they make next.
So, I mean, so I mentioned your book, How to Save the West, at the outset, from just a year ago or so, right? I mean, it's recent offering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you go through the 5 crises that civilizations face and that we're facing right now, and give some historical analogs. So I just, some perspective. I mean, is this a situation, as Truman observed, that there's nothing new about our situation? Maybe the language is a bit different. So maybe it was intolerance and inclusiveness that was used in ancient civilizations that failed. But there are analogs to that too. It's sort of the same pathology that repeats itself.
Okay, so I have some really bad news and I have some hopeful news. In my book, which you kindly mentioned, How to Save the West, the sort of last section is about what I call the crisis of the regime, which really is what we've been talking about here today. The sense that America as founded, as conceived, is slipping away. And that's not an illusion, I don't think. It's not, you'll get made fun of when you say this for being, this kind of jingoistic, naive, Appalachian, barbecue or whatever. But it's really true that we've been suffering a form of regime decay. And when you ask, are there historical precedents? Yeah, I think that the closest thing to the period we are living through is the decline of the great republic of antiquity, which is Rome's republic. Our republic in many ways was modeled off of this republican ideal from ancient Rome. And that ideal, that system of government that we have, was designed to stave off this kind of cycle of decline that the ancient Greek philosophers and after them the Romans sort of saw as part of the natural life cycle of man, that you have these forms of government that rise and then become corrupted and then are replaced by new forms of government. So if you start out with a monarchy, let's see, a strong king kind of leading the country to victory, then eventually the king's son becomes corrupt, you get a tyranny, then the nobles rise up and take power, and that's an aristocracy, but they become corrupt and it's an oligarchy. And then you have this popular uprising, which gives you a democracy and devolves into mob rule. And then the cycle begins again when some new strongman comes along. And the republic is this perfect perpetual motion machine that's designed to kind of balance the different strengths and weaknesses of the different kinds of government against each other, so that you get each one kind of in a different part of your government. And when republics decay, they don't decay the way that other forms of government do. They decay into oligarchies or into these corrupt, kind of crony, elitist courts, essentially. And I think you can make a very good argument that that's what we're seeing. Rome's republic fell in part through political persecutions, like the kind we're seeing with Trump now, and that. For Rome, that kicked off a cycle of these kind of retributions that went back and forth through the courts. So I think one important thing for us to be aware of is that we try our best not to allow this horrible moment to devolve into government by lawfare. But the other thing, of course, for us to contemplate, given everything I've just said, is, are we doomed to repeat that history? Do we have to just go through that same story that Rome went through? I'm a big believer in the rhymes of history, but not the repetition of history. I don't think we are doomed to go through exactly what our forebears went through. But I do think we're flirting with exactly the same forces that brought Rome's republic down in the past. And then when I look at this sort of cyclical story of history from antiquity, I think, where is the resource that I can draw on to kind of get off that track? And I actually don't find it in the ancient pagan world. The ancient pagans were much more fatalist about this stuff. But this is when I turn now to my religious sources of wisdom, not to the ancient history of Greece and Rome, but to the Jewish and Christian scriptures that kind of counterbalance them. And there we find three virtues that St. Paul talks about in Corinthians, that can help us, I think, kind of get off this track, or at least aim off of this track. And the most important one for me right now is hope. Hope is not about pretending everything's better than it is. Hope is not about, imagining that you can just sit back and let everything go the way the world is bound to go. Hope is the insistence on aiming toward the North Star. And for us, I think the North Star is still our regime as founded, is the Constitution and our way of life. I don't think it's out of our reach yet. And each of us has to ask himself where his role is in rebuilding that. If you're a private citizen building a family, the most important thing to do might be to focus on raising your kids and taking them to church and finding a school where they can be built up rather than corrupted. If you're a podcaster like us, you might be leading people toward a saner way of looking at things. But politically, of course, we've got to hope that we can ride this imperfect Trump train into restoration of American values. And are we doomed to fail in that effort? Somewhere down the line, yeah, all human things die. But my hope is in the return of sanity in reaction against some of the horrors that we've seen. I don't think we're doomed to repeat the past, but I think we have to first make ourselves very aware what kind of dangerous forces we're flirting with.
Well, there's no question. I mean, you've seen, I'm sure, the same things I've seen, which are the calls for retribution. I mean, Sean Davis, who I like, but Sean Davis at the Federalist basically saying to Republican candidates, I don't want to hear what your policy proposals are. I want to hear whatever office you're running for. I want to hear your list of Democrats that you're going to try and imprison, because it's literally tit for tat. And I'm not on board with that, but I'm also not on board with Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland and now Republican Senate candidate, saying we need to respect the jury's verdict and just give me that platitude as well. That is wholly unsatisfying too. So
right.
I think this period now, almost regardless of outcome, but particularly if Trump wins in November, boy, this is going to be dicey, because the bloodlust, because of the battering that people have taken, people who play by the rules in this country, and they have just been ridiculed and attacked and imprisoned and um, uh, harassed by federal law enforcement agencies. And nobody is held accountable. You can understand that desire is strong to say, I want to see some reckonings. And if I don't see reckonings, the longer the reckoning takes, the more punitive it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, let me be absolutely clear about this. I don't think that just because we want to avoid a cycle of retribution, we shouldn't actually prosecute criminals to the full extent of the law. And,
Right.
I am not a legal scholar, but I'm fairly convinced that Joe Biden is a criminal. And you're absolutely right. We have a very delicate road to travel here because there needs to be accountability. There needs to be strong the strong wielding of executive power. And we don't want to fall into this trap, which conservatives fall into all the time, of saying, well, something has been done to us unjustly. And so we're going to not do anything because that would be a cycle of retribution, right? That's
Right.
a failure of logic, I think. What we need to do, and this is hard enough, is find a way of moving forward on the basis purely of principle and not of our impulse to revenge. Revenge is such an enticing proposition, right?
Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
exciting and tempting, and especially when you have good cause to be as pissed off as we are. There's always the temptation to just sort of go, full revenge, full retribution. And I think our task going forward is neither to back off out of fear that we're going to, trigger some kind of retribution cycle, to recognize that we are in dire circumstances, that in fact the power of the state has been wielded unfairly against conservatives, against Republicans, and find a way of wielding power effectively against our enemies without doing so simply for the sake of power and simply for the sake of revenge.
Yeah, I mean, going back to those references that you look to when the pagan world doesn't offer any instruction. Vengeance is mine, said the Lord, right? And so it's interesting. I think I was thinking about this now, just in terms of the calls for immediate retribution wherever it can be exacted. Is this is maybe an opportunity where you go to a black conservative leader, intellectual leader like a Shelby Steele, and you have and remember what we say about the past barbarism against Black Americans, right? You don't cure previous injustices with current injustices, right? And so and they would have, and it's Shelby Steele and Bob Woodson and people like that would have the moral authority to really say that and say so let's, as you just said, let's apply the law, let's hold people accountable professionally and legally as is appropriate, but let's not get into the business of what actually the identitarian left is. That's literally what Ibram Kendi advocates, is the way to cure past discrimination is with current discrimination. We don't want to do that.
That's such a terrific point. And if you think about it in your own personal life, I don't think it's all that different. When somebody really screws you over, your instant impulse, and this is just how the human heart is built, is to make your entire life about getting back at that guy. And you've not realized, of course, in the process that now he's won, right? You are now basically his puppet, because anything he does, you're going to want to thwart and frustrate, and you're going to be so absorbed in that desire for revenge that the rest of your life has been totally derailed. We all know people who go into this. We've all been through this path, I think, once or twice. And what we've realized, I hope, gradually, is that actually the best revenge is to win, right? Winning is the best revenge, and then moving on, which puts me in mind of Abraham Lincoln. You mentioned the sort of biblical idea that vengeance belongs to God. And this was a major feature of Lincoln's understanding of the Civil War, it was very profound, in which we don't always really grasp to its full extent. Lincoln explicitly described the Civil War as a judgment of God and a judgment for slavery. and for our failure to bring an end to this abominable practice. And this was a severe thing to say. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to imagine a politician getting away with saying, we've sinned and now we must suffer judgment. But his reason for doing that is that was the only way he could see to say that once the war was over, now it was time for divine mercy. That as long as the war was to last, Americans must accept it as the judgment of God. But as soon as they could bring the war to an end, that would signal that God's judgment was exhausted and that the price had been paid. And so when people come around demanding reparations, as you indicated, or saying that we've got to redistribute all this wealth and power because of the way that, the slavery and America's past has incurred a debt, the answer to that is the debt was paid. It was paid in life upon life and bereavement upon bereavement in the Civil War. And now our task is to rebuild. We are not in a position where we can sit back and say, like, this crisis we're in has been resolved and now we just need to be building back. But I think we always have to have that as our end game, right? Our end game is to put a period on this dark chapter in American history, to bring it to some form of closure, and begin the work of rebuilding, which is less fun and exciting than revenge, but will actually, in the end run, be a path to life.
One of the other crises you talk about in How to Save the West is the crisis of meaning, and sort of reinvigorating the republic with reason and faith, as opposed to sentimentality. Seems like that it may be the most below the fold task, but it may be the toughest one. I mean, it really requires a change in mindset, as I sort of was intimating at the outset, of at least the way at least half the country thinks, or doesn't think, to my point.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I actually think that this stuff, even though, as you indicate, it's less sort of news cycle ready, this stuff about where people find their meaning is in the end going to be what saves or dooms us. Because we've lived through decades and decades, longer than I've been alive, in which the generally accepted conventional wisdom is that material science gives you all the meaning there is to know about the world, because it gives you all the truth there is to know about the world. And I think we really hit hard on the inadequacy of that viewpoint during COVID. It was during COVID that we looked to scientists as if they were priests. They talked to us as if they ran our lives the way that the most kind of repressive medieval cleric you can imagine, right? They had secret knowledge, and that knowledge was the sum of all truth. And in that knowledge, they were going to dictate the tiniest minutia of our lives. And the chaos that ensued shows you how terribly inadequate science is as a blueprint for meaning. Not that science is useless, not that science doesn't have things to teach us, just that science is not the last word on what we are or what we ought to do. It can't tell us anything about what we ought to do, because all it does is describe how the world is at a physical level. And so now I think we are in this new era where people are kind of flailing around, trying to find some highest good, some reason to get out of bed in the morning. And that's a very, very dangerous social condition to be in, on the one hand, because when the human heart is reaching out for meaning, it's likely to latch on to anything. And I think you're seeing some people latch on, for example, to kind of new forms of paganism. You're seeing some people latch onto a worship of the state or of a particular politician. And this goes deeper than red and blue and the stuff that we've been talking about, right down to like, put not your faith in princes, right? What is the thing above all to which you will bend your knee? And here's what I'm seeing, that when I talk about hope, I'm always looking for the places where there's kind of fertile ground to grow in. In this confusion of the sort of post-scientism era, and the era when people are realizing that they can't just rely on science for their highest good, I'm noticing a number of people from very, very different sort of sectors of society start to turn toward what looks more and more like a kind of Christian theism. And the difficulty here is it doesn't always look like what we've been taught to recognize as doctrinal Christianity. And so because people that do believe in the Nicene Creed and in the traditional faith of the church are very protective of that faith, and rightly so, sometimes we can miss these kind of new shoots that are springing up out of the ground. So here's one example that I would give you. It's Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a very brave political dissident who fled an oppressive Islamist regime, only to find that Islamists were also taking over Europe. Somebody I followed for a long time. She was an atheist for a long time because of her experience with Islam. But she came out and said, look, I am now a Christian because I don't think that secular rationalism can steer us through these choppy waters. And I think you need Christian belief to underpin all of the great triumphs of Western civilization, like, universal rights or, individual liberty. These things only come out of a Christian background. And we can't believe in them unless we believe in Christianity. And you see a lot of people saying, well, that just means you're a cultural Christian, right? You're just believing in God because you think it'll get you all these nice things politically. And my feeling about that is, God didn't ask my opinion on whether Ayaan Hirsi Ali is saved, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali didn't ask my opinion on it. But one thing that does seem to matter is which direction I want civilization to be moving. And for somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali to make the shift from pure secularism into a form of Christianity that roots our civilization in the Christian faith. To me, that's a 100% good movement in the right direction. And everything after that is gravy. It's like, I think her faith seems very sincere, but nobody asked me. The real question is, where is the culture moving? So there's an area I think that there's a lot of room for growth, is people realizing that we can't sustain our political life, our civilization, without Christianity. And then in a totally different universe, I would point toward somebody like Russell Brand, who's doing these like new age meditation exercises and seeking some kind of meaning there. And finding that actually it doesn't make sense just to believe in a cosmic void, that there's somebody on the other end of the line. And again, you're hearing people kind of gatekeeping over this and saying, well, he still believes in tarot cards and he still does mysticism. And I get all of those concerns. I really do. I just think that if you really are aware what time it is, what situation we're in, we are not in a position to be kind of nitpicking at other people's brand of Christian theism. What we are in a position to be doing is calling with arms wide open anybody who will move in this direction of believing that there is meaning in life beyond just pleasure and science. And the last thing I'll say about this is that science itself is actually turning into a weird route for people into something beyond science, because people are starting to remember that even the scientific enterprise doesn't make any sense without God. And that's what my new book is about: Light of the Mind, Light of the World. And I'm hoping that kind of those three routes into meaning and into faith will help to kind of alleviate some of the stuff that I talked about in my last book with this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, it's the old Bill Buckley line: you have to give people the room to come over to your side, right? And so,
yeah.
And a lot of these moves are not 180s. They're 45, 15, 20 degrees at a time as people grapple with their own understanding. I guess that people on a path, but I mean that this is people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a great intellectual. Russell Brand is less so, but at least he's thinking. But I mean, my concern, and it really gets to the fundamental question, is just the people that are just feeling their way through life. They're just reactive, and they just feel. It's all sentimentality all the time, and basically, it boils down to a discussion and maybe an advocacy that has to take some form. That look, if you're not a Judeo-Christian society, then you're not going to be a free society for very long. And trying to drive that point home. So, as you say, sort of whatever form, I'm not telling you which church to go to, or I'm just saying, what you just said, understand the underpinnings. And look, if we don't commit to being a peaceful, pluralist society that respects people's faith and has free and fair elections, then we are not going to be a free society for very long. We're going to be at each other's throats, perhaps literally.
That's absolutely right. And I always think about this moment in C.S. Lewis's sort of autobiography of faith, Surprised by Joy, in which he talks about how after World War I, which he fought in, he went through a period of total nihilism and atheism and anger at God for what he saw in the trenches. And he describes his journey back to God and ultimately to Christianity. And he talks about a stage on the journey where he was reading a lot of Wordsworth. And Wordsworth and the English Romantic poets of the 19th century had this kind of almost pantheist, animistic view of nature. That's not quite fair, but they basically believed that, God was in nature and was speaking through nature. And Lewis is looking back on this and he's saying, that wasn't where I was going to land. I don't really believe in the romantic view of the world now. And I needed something more in the end. I needed to come to Christianity. And he has this great line, which I think he takes from Pilgrim's Progress. He says, "For the man coming up from below, this is exactly what I needed." And I think we miss this all the time because we want to skip straight to the Nicene Creed, right? We want to skip from this person that, as you say, is just living by feel, just wandering after the latest shiny object and the latest dopamine hit. And we want to skip straight to, have you accepted the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior into your heart, and also his Virgin Mother, and also like all this other stuff, which all of which I endorse, but which I don't think is actually like a realistic description of how even the most admirable Christians like C.S. Lewis make this journey. My question is always, what's the next stepping stone? What's the direction of travel? And this is true in individual conversations. I have a lot of conversations at the gym, weirdly, with friends of mine that are kind of fuddling their way through life, some of them. And one thing I notice is that there's always a next step, right? There's always, if you don't want to talk about God right now, there's always like, what's the purpose of your life? Why do you get up in the morning? And on that level, it turns out people are philosophers more than we give them credit for. People genuinely hunger for some sort of meaning, but it takes that kind of patient work that I think God actually does with each of us, of offering the next step and waiting as people kind of make that gradual transition. It's all about the direction of travel.
You mentioned Ayan Hirsi Ali. Of course, her husband is the great historian Neil Ferguson. And, he wrote this book a few years ago called The Great Disintegration, talking about the institutional, the mediating institution, civic and cultural disintegrating in addition to governmental. And I wonder, as you're, again, with that lens towards the past to inform our understanding of maybe some of the moves we should make and some of the dangers that are afoot in the present. Like if you had to choose an institution to say this is where we should focus our energy, if that's even possible. I know it's delinking them is sort of it's easy to do intellectually. It's harder to do in the real world. But is it K through 12 education? Is it the church? When people say, well, what, sort of what can I do? Where should I look? What should I focus on in terms of trying to be an agent for improvement? What would you say?
Well, if you asked a plumber about this, he would probably say it's plumbing. If you asked, a fighter pilot about it, he would probably say it's the military. But you've asked an academic, and so I'm going to say it's the academy.
Right.
And I really do believe that. We are obviously living through this moment of terrible, grotesque, and very public self-destruction by our elite educational institutions. You see what's going on at Columbia, at my alma mater, Yale. You see it going on at Harvard, just the way that they have allowed students, or even encouraged students in some cases, to totally abandon their education in favor of ritual, tribal forms of bloodlust. And this is a development that's a long time in the making. We saw a major dimension of it in 2020, but it's been going on for decades and decades. And the question before us is how to rebuild a serious and sensible set of institutions that seeks truth in its highest forms, without all of the resources that have now been kind of bundled up into these prestigious universities. I admire people that want to take back Harvard and Yale and kind of recapture some of these organizations. I think we should be working on that, but I also think we should be working on building parallel institutions. And the reason for that is K through 12 is very important, and it matters immensely what people are taught in high school and elementary school. But from the beginning, really, of Western education, the universitas, which is this kind of collegiate group of scholars that comes together to gather the best that can be known, thought, and said, that really is where the direction of civilization's journey toward truth is set. It's in these what you would now call thought leaders. And back in the 11th century, that's what universities were founded essentially to do, to gather up the best of humanity's knowledge into a coherent system and to guide the direction of travel for the rest of the civilization. It takes a long time to build that kind of institution up. But once you do, it generates its own momentum because it starts to teach people, and the teachers go and teach people, and you get K through 12 educators out of the university system. I think it's been the way we have allowed our universities to become corrupted by oikophobia and self-hatred has been a disaster for us. And I think I'm very encouraged by places like New College, Florida, or University of Texas at Austin that are trying to kind of rebuild that. Real academics are kind of having to go into exile and find places in these institutions. But I think they need to know that their work won't be in vain, because this really is where the direction of travel is going to be set, is in the new academy.
He is Spencer Klavan. He's the host of the Young Heretics podcast. He's an editor-at-large for The American Mind. His last book, How to Save the West, which we've discussed a lot, and his forthcoming book that he mentioned, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God. Spencer Klavan, thanks so much for joining us on Counterculture. Really appreciate your time.
It's been a true pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.